Dr. Farr currently trains American diplomats at the Foreign Service Institute and is also a consultant to the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference. This is not the first time Dr. Farr has testified before Congress, nor is it the first time he has testified before this committee. He is truly an expert, and he too has written a tremendous book that I would recommend to everyone as well on religious freedom. We'll then hear from Dr. John Lenskowski, is founder and president of the Institute of World Politics, an independent graduate school of national security and international affairs in Washington. From 1981 to 1983, Dr. Lenskowski served in the State Department in the Bureau of European Affairs and as special advisor to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Larry Eagleburger. From 83 to 87, he was director of the European and Soviet Affairs at the National Security Council. In that capacity, he served as principal Soviet affairs advisor to President Ronald Reagan. He has been associated with several academic and research institutions in Washington, including Georgetown University, University of Maryland, the American Enterprise Institute, the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and the Council for Inter-American Security, and the International Freedom Foundation. Then we will hear from Dr. Saeed Seed, who is the National Director of the Islamic Society of North America, heading up its Office for Interfaith and Community Alliances in Washington, D.C. He served for 12 years, 94 to 2006, as Secretary General of the Indiana-based National Umbrella Organization, which has more than 300 affiliates all over the U.S. and Canada. Dr. Seed was born in Kashmir and migrated to the United States in the mid-1970s. From 1980 to 83, he served as president of the Muslim Students Association of the United States, USA, in Canada, and pioneered its transformation into a modern-day Islamic Society of North America. He has been actively involved in fostering understanding among world religions and has participated in interfaith dialogues from local to international levels in the United States and Canada. A frequent speaker at interfaith dialogues, he has served as a member of the Board of Trustees of the Council for Parliament of World Religions. In 2000, he was invited to dialogue in the Vatican by the late Pope John Paul II, and in 2008, led the American Muslim Leadership Delegation to meet with Pope Benedict in Washington. Then we'll hear from Neil Hicks from Human Rights First. He advises Human Rights First programs on a wide variety of international human rights issues and serves as a resource to the organization in identifying opportunities to advance human rights around the world. Mr. Hicks also writes and conducts advocacy on issues relating to human rights. Thank you. Sorry about that. Around the world. I had a late-night speech last night. He also writes and conducts advocacy on issues relating to human rights promotion in the Muslim world and on the impact of counterterrorism measures on human rights. Before joining Human Rights First, he worked as a researcher for the Middle East Department of Amnesty International in London, where he worked between 1985 and 1991. He has also served as Human Rights Project Officer for Birzeit University in the West Bank. He is author of many reports and scholarly articles, including The Public Disorder of Blasphemy Laws, A Comparative Perspective, and we welcome him to the subcommittee as well. Dr. Farr, please proceed.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, Ambassador Rooney, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for holding this important hearing. My message today has three parts. First, U.S. religious freedom diplomacy can improve our nation's ability to combat Islamist terrorism. More religious freedom abroad can help prevent the spread of terrorism around the world and protect Americans here at home. Second, our religious freedom diplomacy can protect other fundamental U.S. interests by enhancing political, economic, and strategic stability. Third, a religious freedom diplomacy that employs evidence-based self-interest arguments can reduce religious persecution more effectively than do our current diplomatic methods. Unfortunately, the President's nominee to head U.S. religious freedom policy is not yet at work. I urge the Senate to confirm Governor Sam Brown back immediately. We need him on the job. During the past 2 decades, global religious persecution has increased dramatically, and protections for religious freedom have been in sharp decline. Millions suffer persecution. Tens of millions lack religious freedom. Religion-related terrorism, threatens much of the world, including the United States. But our religious freedom diplomacy has not been understood or used as a counterterrorism weapon. It should be. 20 years of working on this issue have convinced me that a simple proposition is both true and necessary, true and useful, and that is that religious freedom is necessary. It's necessary for the flourishing of every individual and every society. It's necessary to reduce the presence of violent religious extremism. Social scientists at the Religious Freedom Institute, where I work, have amply documented that societies lacking religious freedom are far more likely to incubate, suffer domestically, and export internationally religion-related terrorism. And societies that protect religious freedom generally do not incubate and export religion-related violence and terrorism. So how does this work? How does religious freedom undermine violent religious extremism? First, by protecting anti-extremist Muslim voices who advocate for a tolerant, nonviolent interpretation of Islam. Second, by protecting the rights of non-Muslim communities, not only to exist as tolerated minorities, but to contribute to their societies as equal citizens. Unfortunately, current U.S. counterterrorism policy ignores these connections. That policy consists almost exclusively of the employment of military force, law enforcement, and intelligence. While each is obviously necessary, none is sufficient to defeat Islamist terrorism. This form of terrorism is not simply a military force. It is not simply a cadre of militants whose military defeat, capture, or death will end the threat. It is an ideology, a set of lethal ideas derived from Islam that have proven their capacity to motivate men and women, to kill, to torture, and to destroy. We need an all-of-government religious freedom policy that not only protects the persecuted, but at the same time advances U.S. national security by employing programs and policies that directly target the self-interest of stakeholders in societies where terrorism flourishes. Let me end with an example of Iraq. Since 2014, the United States government has allocated nearly $1.7 billion in humanitarian aid to Iraq, but most of that aid has not reached the Christian and other minorities designated as victims of ISIS genocide. These people are unlikely to return to their homes without our help. For the United States, this presents both a moral and a national security imperative. Religious pluralism is a necessary condition for long-term stability in Iraq. If minorities do not return and stay, Iraq will likely become a perpetual Sunni-Shia battleground where terrorism flourishes. The current administration has pledged to channel aid to these minorities, but financial aid is only the first step. The U.S. should mount a sustained campaign to convince Iraqi stakeholders that they will never live in peace and security without the pluralism that non-Muslim minorities bring. With our help, Iraq must provide security, economic development, and religious freedom to those minorities. It must also provide religious freedom to Muslims who will defend tolerant, nonviolent forms of Islam. We will prevail against Islamist extremism only when we expand our national security strategy to include the advancement of religious freedom, both to protect the persecuted abroad and the American people at home. Thank you.
Dr. Farr, thank you so very much for your testimony. Dr. Lenskowski.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Minority Member, Ambassador Rooney, and members of the subcommittee. I'm honored to be able to discuss how to defeat the ideology of radical Islamism with a particular focus on human rights. The U.S. has spent trillions fighting Islamist terrorism as if it is a military problem, as Dr. Farr has just said, with little reference to what inspires it in the first place. I have a metaphor for this. Our wars are akin to trying to eradicate mosquitoes in your backyard by inviting all your friends over for a garden party, arming them with shotguns, and shooting mosquitoes all afternoon. You will get a few. The problem is that the garden has a puddle where the recruitment of new mosquitoes is going on, and we're doing very little about it. This is a problem of politics, propaganda, ideology, culture, economic opportunity, and extremist politicized religious doctrines. To solve this problem necessitates fighting a war of ideas, and the problem is that we have virtually no ideological warriors in this war. We have a Cold War precedent where we worked to undermine the Marxist-Leninist core of the Soviet system. Among other things, this war required anathematizing communist human rights violations and offering the peoples of the Soviet Empire a positive alternative: human rights, freedom, democracy, and hope for a better life. These efforts centered around giving people the courage to demand political change and respect their human rights, and the respect of their human rights. Today, we must also use similar means to target the ideological core of radical Islamism. This ideology differs from politically moderate Islam insofar as it seeks to turbocharge the Islamization process by conducting jihad of the sword and resettlement jihad, the migration to non-Muslim lands, establishing separatist enclaves that run according to Sharia, and culminating in political demographic conquest. This ideology, which incorporates Marxist-Leninist strategy, has been key to the recruitment of new jihadists, both terrorists and resettlement jihadists. It depends on generating hatred against the infidel, principally through a moral attack against colonialism, Zionism, U.S. hegemony, and the West's moral degradation. Defeating it requires an ideological counterattack based on superior moral precepts. Such an effort has two components, both of which focus on human rights. The first involves telling the truth about radical Islamism. This means ending self-censorship about jihadism and conducting an information campaign exposing jihadist ideology, the weaponization of religious doctrines, the denial of human rights under Sharia, and the crimes and human rights violations of Islamist regimes. The second component involves offering a positive alternative, including the promotion of human rights. First, it is necessary to promote the dignity of the human person as the creation of God. It is as a result of this dignity that man possesses inalienable rights in the first place, that come not from other men, but, as our founders said, from a creator. Perhaps the most effective human rights campaign today in this ideological war has been conducted by a private nonprofit group called Good of All and its academic centers on 3 continents. They promote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as an idea virus to prevent the radicalization of digital natives, the younger generation who have grown up with social media. The idea is to present an idealistic vision that rejects violence and the human rights violations that have attended radical Islamist movements and regimes. Central to this effort is the appeal to Muslim women whose rights are systematically violated wherever radical Islamism prevails. Many of these women have participated in the organization's campaign to produce YouTube videos that have exposed the dark side of Sharia, the stoning of women, acid attacks, honor killings, and wife beating. There are also efforts within the Islamic world to fight radical jihadism. In Indonesia, there's a long history of challenging the radical secular political goals of jihadism by offering a vision of Islam that is pluralist and tolerant. For example, Indonesia's former president, Abdurrahman Wahid, argued that there is no such thing as a genuine secular Islamic state. The true Islamic state, he said, is when an entire people have achieved holiness. A new assemblage of 41 Muslim nations, the Islamic Military Counterterrorism Coalition, stresses the importance of fighting terrorism in the domains of ideology and communications, in addition to counterterrorism finance and the military, by promoting moderation, tolerance, compassion, diversity, and the value of human life. It remains to be seen how effective this effort proves to be. The U.S. government is intellectually, culturally, and organizationally unprepared to combat both elements of the radical jihadist threat and to fight a true war of ideas. There is no agency of the U.S. government charged with ideological warfare. What must be done is to create a new U.S. public diplomacy agency that will become a force in U.S. foreign policy that will concentrate on relations with and influence over people and not just governments. A renewed concentration on public diplomacy and strategic influence will go a long way toward giving America a capability to secure our country while minimizing the need to use force to do so. Thank you.
Doctor, thank you very much for those very thoughtful remarks. Dr. Seat?
Thank you. Distinguished leaders, greetings of peace, and in Arabic, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for inviting me to this hearing, a valuable opportunity to present my understanding, experience, and vision about the role of Islam in promoting peaceful societies and our ability to counter the violent extremism not only in Muslim societies, among Muslims, but for people of all faiths and no faith. The past October marked the 19th anniversary of the landmark International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, which upholds religious freedom as a core American value and a universal human right. The law calls for the U.S. government to stand for liberty and with the persecuted, to use and implement appropriate tools in the United States foreign policy apparatus to promote respect for religious freedom by all governments and all peoples. This institutional landmark act is very important not just for us as Americans, but for us as humanity. Nearly 2 decades after the law's passage, freedom of religion or belief is unfortunately an unrealized ideal in too many parts of the world. The essence of Islam can be summarized as those who protect and promote religious freedom. I will elaborate this further in my speech as I give you a brief background of myself and of the American Muslims. Muslim community is as diverse as America itself, as humanity itself. We have members from all colors and ethnicities, from all schools of thought. Our success to bring them together and build institutions in large numbers, several thousand Islamic centers, several hundred full-time Islamic schools, and hundreds of Sunday schools is a historical achievement by itself. The evolution of this community over half a century has strengthened my vision and of my colleagues in democratic and pluralist institutions as most congenial for Islam as a faith and for Muslims believing in a peaceful message of Islam. The vision of Islam was developed from the historical vision of the Prophet of Islam when he migrated from his hometown, Mecca, to Medina, where he recognized and respected the diversity of population in terms of their faiths and tribes. In his hometown, he was dealing with one tribe, the Quraysh, his own kith and kin, who persecuted him and his followers and did not allow him to teach and preach his religion. In contrast, he chose to move to a city where he invited representatives of different tribes, Aus, Khazraj, immigrants from Mecca, and several different Jewish tribes, and jointly with all of them drafted a constitution of Medina state where all the participating entities were given freedom in practice to practice their religion and collectively be responsible for the welfare, safety, security of the new state. The Medina Constitution has served as a reminder for us as a forerunner of the United States Constitution, giving us individual rights and freedom of religion. While developing our Muslim community, we had to educate our members that the only way we could develop our congregations and communities was to incorporate our organizations and adopt constitutions. This helped our members to become religiously conscious of the rights and duties, rules and regulations that govern our Islamic centers, our umbrella organization with which these centers were affiliated. This provided a rich experience in mutual respect, power sharing, membership of men and women in administering our institutions. Eventually, we have by now Muslim women not only serving on the boards of Islamic organizations, but heading national institutions. The Medina model of the Prophet, after his passing away, and after the 4 successors became irrelevant because the dynastic rule of monarchy for all the subsequent centuries. Today, Muslim countries that are independent and are members of OIC, because they are Muslim majority countries, are ruled by either monarchs or dictators. American Muslim community is the only Muslim community in the world that has lived in a democracy with a constitutional commitment to freedom of religion, highlighting the essence of Islam and promotion of human rights. There have been times when hatred against Islam has resulted in dangerous acts of violence and intolerance. But it is in those times, those moments of challenge, we have experienced the highest level of support from other faith groups denouncing hate against Muslims in the name of religion. When the pastor in Florida threatened to burn the Quran as a means of intensifying hate against Muslims and Islam, the major religious organizations in America, National Council of Churches, Catholic Conference of Bishops, Union of Reformed Judaism, American Baptist Church, and others came forward to denounce the pastor's hateful rhetoric and express their support to me, representing the largest and the oldest Islamic organization. And they came had a press conference in Washington, D.C., and established a campaign called Shoulder to Shoulder, standing with American Muslims against anti-Muslim sentiment, upholding American values. This campaign is steered and funded by more than 30 Christian and Jewish national organizations here today. The Quranic verse, "There is no compulsion in religion," has been our guiding light. We have people coming into Islam and going out of Islam. We are proud to say that we have a large number of leaders of the American Muslim community who were not born Muslims. We are aware of Muslims who have of their free will chosen to give up their religion. We find nothing in the Quran or in the example of the Prophet that would have commanded us not to allow such a free will to be treated with respect to the choice of religion or no religion. It has been painful at times for us to see some hate mongers producing cartoons and false allegations against our Prophet. While it is our duty to promote a better understanding about our Prophet's life and contribution, we cannot fight hate with hate. Again, we find in the life of the Prophet instances where he was directly insulted, but he prayed for the misguided for peace and guidance. However, we should not allow extremists to take action in the name of Islam as a means of retaliation. We have built robust partnerships with people of other faiths and celebrated theological developments that we appreciate as Muslims. The Nostra Aetate from the Second Vatican opened the doors of Catholics to remove the stigma against Jews as the ones responsible for the crucifixion and welcoming Abrahamic roots of Judaism and Islam. We celebrated the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate in 2015 with U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops as a welcome reform within Christianity. We celebrated this year the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther's desire to understand Islam and engage with it, and his commissioning the translation of the Quran for the first time in Christian history. We have worked with various denominations of Judaism to have a better understanding between Jewish and Muslim communities under our joint project called Children of Abraham. These achievements in the understanding of our faith in a plural society have tremendous implications for the Muslim world. The books, the electronic materials are of utmost importance for giving hope and confidence to our new generations around the globe. Our American Constitution provides us the opportunity for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, the three key elements of human rights. American Muslims have thrived due to the liberties that every American citizen in this great country can enjoy. Now it is time when we need to work together as Americans. The best of America is represented as love thy neighbor and as neighbors. I am always heartened to see organizations like Islamic Relief working directly with government and interfaith organizations alike to solve problems and bring relief. The work of LDS charities, United Methodist Church, Catholic Relief Services, and many more in partnership with Islamic Relief USA rebuild our nation's communities and give hope to them. When we work together across all faiths, America is stronger. Organizations like Guidance Residential, which provides American Muslims the opportunity to be compliant with their Sharia requirement that to buy their homes without interest. And it's amazing that 97% of the people who are benefiting from this, from the guidance residential, are not Muslims. American Muslims flourish when America flourishes, and America excels when all of its citizens excel. For us to make America great, we have to reach out to all Americans of all faiths, all ethnicities, all backgrounds with respect and dignity, opening up opportunities and prosperity for all. Thank you for your time and this opportunity to be here with you today.
Dr. Seed, thank you very much for your testimony and leadership. I'd like to now yield the floor to Mr. Hicks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and other members of the subcommittee, thank you for convening this hearing to call attention to what we at Human Rights First view as the imperative need to include human rights promotion as an indispensable element of effective policy aimed at countering and preventing violent extremism. Counterterrorism measures that are not rooted in respect for human rights risk being counterproductive. The recent histories of numerous countries, Egypt being one important example, point to the dangers inherent in counterterrorism responses that are overly focused on military force, repression, and denial of human rights. These approaches fuel grievances, which create escalating cycles of violence between state security forces and violent extremists that become hard to contain. Human Rights First is concerned that the Trump administration has exhibited a marked preference for close cooperation with authoritarian leaders in the struggle against terrorism and violent extremism, instead of emphasizing the need for US partners to end violations and extend human rights protections as an integral part of shared efforts to prevent extremism and combat terrorism. The clearest example of this approach may be seen in President Trump's speech at at the Arab Islamic American Summit in Riyadh on May the 21st of this year. Trump spoke of a new chapter and of new approaches, but there is nothing new about a US approach to the Middle East rooted in alliances with authoritarian governments. By aligning the United States uncritically with a Saudi-led authoritarian regional order, President Trump may hope that he is turning the clock back to a more stable time. But the protracted collapse and inherent instability of the Arab authoritarian order has been one of the root causes of both the spread of terrorism over the last 20 years and of the region's many unresolved conflicts, which have provided hospitable territory and recruitment opportunities for violent extremist groups. One of the few specific policy proposals in the Riyadh speech was a call on all nations of conscience to isolate Iran. President Trump is right to point to the destabilizing activities of the regime in Tehran, but a one-sided position in the regional conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which has taken on an increasingly inflammatory sectarian tone in recent years, thanks to the policies of both sides, will only escalate violence and instability. In Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi seized power in July 2013 on a promise of restoring order and defeating extremism and terrorism. But his methods have made things far worse. Violence has risen, claiming civilian and military casualties on an unprecedented scale. The virulently anti-Sufi propaganda of ISIS was a clear contributory factor in the recent mosque attack in Sinai. This sectarian hate speech is propagated by the religious establishment in Saudi Arabia and put into bloody practice by ISIS. After this latest atrocity, President Trump should be urgently in touch with his friends in Riyadh to end the incitement to violence against Sufis in Saudi religious teaching. A second area where the US government can exert influence is through its military and intelligence cooperation on counterterrorism issues with countries like Egypt. The Congress has been raising concerns that President Sisi's counterterrorism approach is exacerbating the problem, but much more needs to be done. The Senate version of the 2018 appropriations bill includes some strong and specific language imposing human rights conditions on military assistance, but specifically exempts funds appropriated for counterterrorism from these conditions. The Egyptian government claims success in its fight against terrorism because it is killing terrorists and denying ISIS control of territory. But killing and destruction are not deterring Egypt's terrorists. Sisi's government is badly in need of a new plan, and the US government should be forthright in urging Cairo to look beyond a failed security-centric approach. Absence of state control over territory has been a factor in the development of violent extremism in Syria and Iraq. The devastating conflict in Syria and Iraq has been fueled by sectarian incitement, exacerbating divisions between Shia and Sunni Muslims. The proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia has heightened the sectarian character of the conflict and thereby made sectarianism a primary driver of violent extremism in many parts of the region. The Tunisian context provides a point of contrast. Avoiding falling into the declining spiral of a destructive binary struggle between authoritarianism and violent extremism is something that binds Tunisians together, despite abiding political differences, a weak economy, and a fragile internal security situation. Tunisia is not paradise. Its discontented youth have provided thousands of foreign fighters to ISIS in Syria. In part, this is a product of the lingering harm inflicted by decades of authoritarian rule, notably the weakening of traditional religious power centers, tainted by close association with state authorities. Corruption, youth unemployment, and lack of opportunity fuel grievances, especially among educated youth who have ready access to the internet and social media. Tunisia's democratic transition has particular importance to the struggle against violent extremism on a regional and global level. It offers an alternative way that breaks out of the vicious circle of perpetual conflict between authoritarianism and extremism. To succeed, Tunisia will need the sustained support of the international community. It will also need to continue to implement in practice the maxim that fighting terrorism is not just something that the state does for its people. It is something that people are motivated to do for themselves in partnership with the state and the security forces, but also through strong, independent civil society organizations. The United States can do much more to confront violators and, perhaps even more importantly, to reinforce the link between human rights and security. Too many governments continue to view human rights as an obstacle to security-related efforts. It is therefore incumbent on the United States to explain why the exact opposite is true. There are positive human rights objectives to be advanced that should be at the center of bilateral relationships with partners in the multilateral struggle against terrorism. Closing space for civil society and peaceful political activities facilitates the expansion of violent extremism and terrorism. Conversely, respecting fundamental freedoms, especially the freedom of assembly and association, is one of the most important defense mechanisms against violent extremism. Respect for religious freedom is an essential part of countering violent extremism, as Dr. Farr explained. A comprehensive strategy must address the religious and ideological narratives that lure the vulnerable and disenfranchise segments of society to violent extremism. To be effective as counterweights to extremist discourse, religious institutions must be, and be seen to be, independent of political control. And governments must ensure that diverse religious views are not only tolerated, but encouraged. One of the primary root causes that must be addressed more vigorously is the proliferation of armed conflicts and of ungoverned spaces that provide opportunity to violent extremist groups. The United States, because of its unique reach and influence, has an inescapable responsibility to lead and energize multilateral efforts through the United Nations and other multilateral institutions to end these devastating conflicts. The absence of effective conflict resolution mechanisms on both national and international levels is one of the greatest challenges to the implementation of a comprehensive countering violent extremism strategy. Thank you.
Mr. Hicks, thank you for your testimony and your insights. I'd like to begin the questioning with Dr. Farr. First, let me thank you when you testified in September of 2014 on the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act, which is making its way through Congress. You made a number of recommendations, and they were largely, many of them, incorporated into the bill, including the training of Foreign Service officers. So I want to thank you for those recommendations. In your testimony, just let me, before I get to that, on Monday I met again with Chaldean Catholic Bishop Bashar Warda, who I first met last year in Erbil. He has led the effort to help Christians and Yazidis with critical humanitarian aid, including food, clothing, shelter, medicine, and spiritual help, because a lot of people were, as he said, unbelievably broken by ISIS as they lost loved ones and themselves were tortured, and the women often sexually abused. We did not have, as I think everyone knows now, any U.S. foreign aid going to assist the Christians and the Yazidis. I went to an IDP camp with 6,000 people, not a dime of U.S. support. That is in the process of changing. But we introduced bipartisan legislation, H.R. 390, the Iraq and Syria Genocide Emergency Relief and Accountability Act. It passed the House last June. I would say, for the record, I'm gravely disappointed that the Senate has one hold on it, and it still has not. It's been released from committee. It still has not made its way to the floor. President Trump has said he will sign it. So it's a concern. But I bring this up because on Monday, Bishop Warda not only stressed urgency, it's winter, people are cold, they can get sick, they need humanitarian assistance. If it wasn't for the Knights of Columbus and others that forked over $40 million, we would have had mass casualties and large numbers of deaths, particularly for children and the fragile elderly. But he made the point that you made, Dr. Farr, about, and you said religious pluralism is a necessary condition for long-term stability in Iraq. We've heard that before. I heard it from Ray Surich, the Grand Mufti, former Grand Mufti of Bosnia when I was in Sarajevo, and he said, the Christians and the Muslims and the Jews need to work together, and we do. In comes the radicals, and they change everything. There's the tipping point towards death and destruction, and he spoke out, I think, very boldly. He was concerned about the Wahhabis coming in and was very clear and open about it, which I found extremely refreshing and encouraging. I heard the same thing when Bishop Angelos testified here and talked about what the Coptic Christians do in Egypt. Not only should they live and thrive because they have a right, it's universally recognized right, a great historic faith tradition, but they also help the moderate Muslims in Egypt. And you've made that same point again. I would ask if you could elaborate on that. And I would also ask my second question to Dr. Linskowski. You said in your testimony, you spoke of the similarities between Marxism and Leninism and radical forms of Islamic thought. I'm a great fan, and I've read all the books by Solzhenitsyn. I remember he talked about Marxist-Leninism being militant atheism. It's a hatred of God, certainly as we see God. And Solzhenitsyn made that famous statement when he said, why did it all happen? All the massive killings, the attacks on Jews and everyone else, Christians, the Orthodox Church. And he says, because we have forgotten God. And you've made the connection between these extremists. If you could elaborate on that, I think that would be very helpful for the committee. And finally, Dr. Said, you talked about no compulsion in religion. And, such wonderful words. There should be no right to believe or not to believe. When we did the Frank Wolf bill, the opening part of that was that it's a right. You can believe or not believe. It's up to you. How do you convince other Muslims that there should be no compulsion in religion? Dr. Farr.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Just to restate briefly the question, and that is the question of pluralism as stabilizing. If history teaches us anything on this issue, it is that when any government or any state is completely dominated by one religion, and of course the history of Christianity and Catholicism helps us make this point, when the church and the state are in cahoots in such a way that minorities are excluded, bad things happen to everybody, not just the minorities, but the state and the majority religion. It's there. Our founders understood it. This ought not to be rocket science for us today. And yet, we do not approach, we being the United States government, do not approach this problem of Islamist extremism with this very simple, powerful historical premise in mind that we ourselves as Americans it ought to be part of our DNA, that if we simply treat this as a humanitarian matter and spend money to return people to their homes, but we don't provide them the opportunity to be integrated into these societies as minorities with equal rights, then we will not have served anybody. So this is why I put the emphasis on going to the stakeholders in Iraq in the example I gave, the Muslim stakeholders, to make a self-interest argument to them. It's not self-evident to them. They have not learned the lesson of Western history, if you will. But this isn't about criticizing Islam or anybody else. It's about making a very practical point. You will never live in peace and security if you don't get this issue of pluralism right, and we can help.
Thank you, Congressman. You've asked a very interesting question about the relationship between Marxism, Leninism, and radical Islamism. There are two basic dimensions of this. One is the rather explicit discussion of Marxist-Leninist strategy by Said al-Qutb, who is one of the principal ideologues of radical Islamism. And he was an admirer of communist tactics and communist revolutionary practice. So that really that's one dimension of the radical Islamist agenda, which has very much to do with the exercise and manipulation of power. Perhaps the more interesting question has very much to do with theological and philosophical matters. As you said, Alexander Solzhenitsyn said that the problem is the rejection of God, both by communism and by secular elites in the West who have forgotten the fundamental foundations that ultimately are the origins of our entire Western concepts of human rights. What is going on in Islam, first of all, with radical Islamists, is that they will take the Islamic doctrine that Allah is pure will, and that Allah wills everything. He wills every minute, every second of every day, and that means He wills the cholera epidemic in Calcutta. He wills the rape of the 13-year-old girl, and so if He wills everything, then the terrorist can come along and say, well, if I want to kill 60 people in the marketplace in Baghdad, then if I succeed in doing so, then Allah must have willed it. And all of a sudden, the terrorist's will is equated with Allah's will. He becomes his own God in his sphere. And, you know, as Whittaker Chambers reminds us about communism, it goes back to the Garden of Eden, where the serpent tells Adam and Eve, "Ye shall be as gods. You can reject what the man upstairs is telling you to do and establish your own moral standards." And so this now gets into another very interesting question about Islam, which is the fact that there is no Islamic pope. There is no theological authority who can say that this is what the correct doctrine is. The religion is very much up for grabs, and people from many different sectors of the religion can claim authenticity based on citing their own selective passages from the Quran. The Quran says, as Dr. Saeed says, that there is no compulsion in religion, but the Quran says other things about cutting the throats of infidels, and that this can be done when people are at war with Islam. Well, this gets into the question of, well, is it true that infidels are at war with Islam? There is a relativism in this, which is very akin to the running of Marxist ideology, where you basically can determine what the proper doctrine is according to circumstances. In Lenin's famous speech to the youth leagues in the 1920s, in 1920, he said there is no such thing as objective moral standards. That is a bourgeois prejudice. The real moral standards are whatever is good is that which helps the revolution, and whatever is evil is that which hinders the revolution. And so does blowing up a bus load of innocent school children, is that good or evil? Well, it all depends upon whether it helps the revolution. You can draw circumstances where it could do one or the other. And so what you have here when there is this kind of relativism and within Islam is that people can come along and say that the end justifies the means, which is what the Islamists do, and it is uncannily similar to the problem of Marxist-Leninist morality.
Congressman, allow me to make a comment also.
Push your button there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Allow me to make a comment and bring a different comment on this. He mentioned Ustad Sayyid Qutb of Egypt, who is being used and whose writings are being interpreted and by the extremists. Ustad Sayyid Qutb came to America in 50s on a fellowship to Colorado. He stayed here for a year. There were no Muslims there. There was no Islamic center there. His language was very limited. He could not establish connection and communication and understand what is the strength of America, what I have been discussing. Today, in Colorado, the same city where he came, we have more than a dozen Islamic centers. We have a vibrant Muslim community in Colorado. So you can imagine the difference and the distance of the experience. 2 years ago, we had a guest from Lebanon, Sheikh Abu Zaid. He was invited here to address the annual prayer breakfast that we have here in Washington. So he addressed there. Then I invited him to the Congress here on Friday. I am sure that you know that we have Friday prayer congregation in the Congress. So I knew about his orientation and understanding as a scholar, a highly respected scholar. So I asked him to come and give his sermon here. So he was amazed. He couldn't believe it, that there is Friday prayer being held in the Congress. And then he went from city to city addressing various Muslim communities, growing, prosperous, and he went back to Lebanon. Ustad Sayyid Qutb had written a book called America as I Saw It, and you can imagine what he had seen 60 years ago. Very bleak for him in terms of Islamic presence in America. And here you have Abu Zaid going and writing a book exactly with the same name, America allati ra'aytuha, America that I have seen. It's amazing how he feels so reassured that this is a country where Islam is flourishing and Muslims are dealing with their neighbors in a very positive and constructive way. So what I am trying to say is that there are certain very clear declarations which make Islam what Islam is. One of them is La ikraha fid din. This is in the 2nd chapter of the Quran, a very clear enunciation of the fundamental value of Islam. Now, we never saw any deviation from it during the life of the Prophet. Rather, he benefited, he actually utilized his relationship with other faiths. When his people were being persecuted in Mecca, he told them the only people who can understand what I am trying to do here to bring Islam, faith in one God and relationship with Jesus and Moses and so on, the only people who can help you from getting some help out of this torture and so on is a Christian country in our neighborhood, that is in Ethiopia at that time. And actually, a delegation of his followers, these Muslims, he went there, and the king there, he gave them asylum. This was the relationship between Islam and Christianity. But you are aware that during the medieval times, the relationship was changed into a confrontational relationship. We had crusades for several hundred years. So therefore, perceptions were changed. So that's why during that period, if somebody abandoned Islam and joined something else, it was not just a change of hearts. It was not just change of faith. It was changing alliance, becoming your enemy, and therefore it would not be tolerated. So the same verse was not in operation because it did not say la ikraha fid din, deen is religion. So they were thinking that it is actually a political affiliation. So the result is in every Muslim country, it is part of our legal system there that a change of religion cannot be tolerated. But for the first time during the last 50 years in this country, we have created these communities and neighborhoods. We have experienced how it is critical for us to benefit from the freedom of religion. And we have not seen anywhere in the scripture against that. I have been giving this example. How do we teach Muslims? It's very straightforward, that help them to understand the context and the Quranic, unqualified Quranic statement. So I wanted to give one example if you think time will allow.
No, it doesn't. Briefly, I do have a meeting with Mitch McConnell that I've been trying for a month to get on H.R. 390, which is the bill that we're trying to get out of the Senate. But we will then yield to Ms. Bass, and Dan Donovan will take over in the chair. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good luck over there in the Senate. I wanted to ask a couple of points of clarification. Dr. Farr, when you were talking about religious freedom, and I agree with you, of course we need to have religious freedom, but I think about in some of the places where that we've been talking about today, we can have all the religious freedom in the world, but if people don't have food, if people don't have a way to survive, then they are going to go with whatever group, organization, religion is going to provide them a way to survive. And I think about religious pluralism, and I also think, we're talking about Islam, but, you can have the same tendencies on the other side, too. So, the idea that there might be some people that believe that Muslims shouldn't be allowed in Congress, or that you should not take the oath of office with the Quran, and there have been sentiments like that here. And so I just wanted to know if you would speak to that for a few minutes, and then I also wanted to talk about a few other things.
Well, thank you, Ms. Bass. I agree with you in your earlier comments, and you're referring back to them about the holistic approach. I think it's important that you have all of these considerations in a U.S. policy trying to undermine extremism, but it's my view that religious freedom has been the missing part of that policy, which has been the burden of what I've been trying to say. We've been pouring money into many societies for many years with the intent of helping economic development, with the intent of helping civil society. All of these things I support. I think they're good. But religious freedom as an aspect of this, I think, has been missing. With respect to our need to, if I can rephrase slightly what you said, in our own country to model religious freedom, I couldn't agree more. It's very important that, as we have done historically, never perfectly, but we have all agreed to the aspiration given to us by our founders in the First Amendment that everyone in America has religious freedom. Everyone has a voice. And I think that this is under siege, personally, from both sides of the aisle. I think we have a big problem in our country about religious freedom. As I say in my testimony, it's very difficult to sell a product in which you no longer believe or which you're confused about. So I think I'm agreeing with you, Ms. Bass. I think this is very, very important that we talk about all of these things, them and us.
Exactly, and I worry about the individual in the Senate that we might confirm and then not give him the tools to actually, do his job. And I also worry about the vilification of Islam, that, we collapse sometimes the distortion of Islam that has taken place with the religion itself. And so some of your comments about, and I'm sorry, I don't want to mispronounce your name, about Marxism, Leninism, and ideology and all, I wanted you to expand on a little bit, because you're making a comparison, I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, between Marxism, Leninism, and radical Islam. And Marxism, Leninism, in terms of how you organize a society, the economic foundations of Marxism, Leninism, how I just don't understand that comparison at all.
The point that I was making has not so much to do with economic matters at all. Marxism, Leninism is a theory of knowledge, it's a theory of history, it's a theory of economy. It's
Right. You're talking about dialectical
society,
historical materialism?
and all of that stuff. It's many, many things. But at the heart of it is a fundamental materialistic philosophy,
Right.
which means the rejection of God, the rejection of any spiritual matters,
Right.
and the rejection, therefore, of objective moral standards, a transcendent, objective, universal moral order that either inheres in nature or comes from God. It can only come, objective moral standards of right and wrong can only come from those two places. And the
Can only
Marxist
come from what
Leninists,
places?
the objective standards of right and wrong can only come either by inhering in nature somehow, or they can be given to us by God, by some higher moral intelligence that infuses them into the human heart. And either way, this is, the philosophers call this the natural law. The law, the C.S. Lewis called it the law of decent behavior.
So if one, under Marxism-Leninism, does not subscribe to God, how does that relate to Islam?
It relates to Islam because,
That does believe in God.
Because you can, because first of all, under Marxism-Leninism, people choose what is right and wrong according to circumstances. If, for example, in my little example of blowing up that school bus of children, if you blow it up and the result is that the people of the society react with a sort of a police state reaction, huge new security measures. Well, all kinds of people could become alienated from a police state environment, and they will develop a revolutionary consciousness against the state. And this will be good for the Marxist revolution.
We
So
fight
that's one-
wars.
so
We
that-
fight wars
Sure, well, but that's
to get
one
rid
example.
of an ideology.
That's one example. But alternatively, the blowing up that school bus may awaken the sleeping giant of a complacent society to be more vigilant and against revolutionary forces that blew up that bus. And so, people do terrorist acts as the propaganda of the deed.
Right.
It's to promote their political agenda. And so the radical Islamists perform these propaganda acts of the deed, and because they believe that it is morally correct, which means they are rejecting the natural law
So let me
view
just
of this, and
let me just explain to you what I'm concerned about, because, and I'm not sure, again, if you were saying this, and if you weren't, tell me.
yes.
If we view this from the perspective that the way we should proceed is the way we did during the anti-communist period, and if you take the continent of Africa, for example, we made some pretty bad decisions because we were fighting communism. So we chose some bad sides. We supported apartheid, we supported colonial powers, because we were trying to defeat communism, instead of missing the main point, which is why people were driven toward one ideology or another. It was because people were trying to survive, and they were trying to address their social economic conditions. So when I hear you, I feel like you might be saying that the way we need to approach this time period is a battle over ideologies, and that we need to convince the Islamic world that our ideology is better, as opposed to looking at some of the root causes that drive people toward one ideology or another. So I would just ask you, is that what you're saying, that we need to fight this ideologically?
Yes, we do need to fight it ideologically. Poverty has existed for centuries. And, I visited all the countries in the Middle East back in the 1960s. I saw desperate poverty there. Beggars everywhere, desperate poverty. And my heart went out to those people. The problem is that they weren't generating terrorists the way terrorists are being generated today. And people, yes, Harry Truman said in his famous Truman Doctrine speech that communist revolution can be kindled in the soil of poverty and strife.
Okay,
I agree with that.
Excuse me, let me move on, because I would like to ask Dr. Saeed, do you see a comparison between Marxism, Leninism, and radical Islam? And then I would like to ask Mr. Hicks to respond to this dialogue. Dr. Saeed.
It's very difficult for
Can you put your microphone on?
Historically, it is Islam that ultimately brought down communism. You remember in Afghanistan, when they occupied Afghanistan, and we were able to help the local Muslims to fight against them, because it was a religious duty for them. So in that sense, I cannot see any comparison between the two. What I see basically is that in the Muslim world, because of, as you were mentioning, dictatorships, because of extremely difficult situations where people were tortured, tormented, and it has created a very strange kind of psychology. And they are using Islamic piety and other appeals to Islam to fight against something that they believe is evil and something that has to be destroyed.
Okay.
So,
Mr. Hicks?
Thank you, Ms. Bass. Just to say a few words about this discussion. I think the parallel that Dr. Lensowski is describing is religion being manipulated to become a totalitarian ideology. And in that happening, there is obviously some similarity with totalitarian Marxism. What I don't see, and where I think I differ with Dr. Lensowski, I don't see that this is particular to Islam. I think in the past we have seen other religions being manipulated and used in similar ways, and having totalitarian ideologies. Arguably, we're seeing now in Myanmar, Buddhism being used as a totalitarian ideology to commit to ethnic cleansing and genocide against Muslim inhabitants of Myanmar. So yes, religions are susceptible to this kind of totalitarian interpretation, but it's not uniquely Muslim. If I can just say a few words about how I think my testimony differs a bit from some of the testimonies we've heard today. I was trying to focus on what I see as being the push factors for violent extremism, and they include factors like authoritarianism, sectarianism, conflict, and ungoverned space. And unfortunately, I see all of these problems not being remedied by current US policy, and in fact being exacerbated in certain cases. And there are certain remedies which I briefly mentioned in my remarks, and which I go into in more depth in my longer testimony, which include promoting religious freedom. So I completely agree with Dr. Farr, but also promoting other types of human rights and basic freedoms.
Thank you. And before I turn it over to you, Mr. Chair, let me just wrap up by saying that I just believe that we need to have a comprehensive approach. I mean, I support religious freedom. I know it's ideology. I know we shouldn't vilify Islam. And I know we need to look at the human rights issues. But I do think it's really important for us to learn from history and to go back and to look at some of those past periods, which is why I was taking issue with it just being, an ideological fight. We need all of the above. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ranking.
I just wanted to say, lest you misunderstand, I focused on the ideological issue because it has been the one hugely neglected part of all of this. I totally support the comprehensive approach that you're talking about.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Before we continue, I'd like to enter into the record a statement by Kumar Al-Huda, Director of Security and Violent Extremism at the Center of Global Policy. Hearing no objections, so ordered. At least two of our witnesses have a hard stop at 12 o'clock, so I'd ask the members if they could keep their questions shorter than they've been, just so that everybody gets a chance. Chair now recognizes Ambassador Rooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, all the talk about faith and the role of faith in God in human behavior and the dialectical materialism of the Soviet Marxist-Leninist ideology that tried to expunge it reminds me of Pope Benedict's famous quote that the notion that there is a God gives rise to the concept of human rights and of individuals taking responsibility for their own behavior, which was kind of paraphrasing St. Augustine. And I think that thread runs through a lot of this, is having individuals take responsibility for their behavior because they truly believe in the dignity of each human being. With that said, there's a question here going back to the Marrakesh Declaration and the protection of religious minorities. And I'd like to get your all's opinion of how the declaration can really be meaningful in the context of the existence of blasphemy laws and Sharia law applied in a civil context. Dr. Saeed introduced me the great line one time of, "We need a Nostra Aetate from Islam." And so I think that we have lofty goals, but how do we square those with what's really going on in the world right now?
Should I speak?
Whichever one. Each one of you have touched on the Marrakesh Declaration and Sharia law and blasphemy laws.
We believe Marrakesh Declaration was a result of our efforts here. We were able to convince them that in the light of the Medina, this covenant, we need to do something on the same lines on an international level. Because the issue was how Muslims are committed through Islam to make sure that the minorities living in Muslim majority countries are a trust from God, and they have to be given full freedom in their religion, safety, and security. But the new approach that we had developed as American Muslims is this reconnecting with the Medina Declaration, with the Medina state. So living in a pluralist society. So that gave it some new sense of direction, and the participants were very excited about that. That's why I believe that we have collectively a responsibility to watch and see that Marrakesh Declaration is being implemented and followed up.
So would the declaration a call for the elimination of blasphemy laws and Sharia law applied in a civil context?
It sets a stage for that. Because I was giving the examples here how, as American Muslims living so closely and having developed our institutions in collaboration with people of other faiths, it has helped us directly to address these things. So I was giving one example about this freedom of religion. We have in American Islamic centers people coming from time to time, and they say that we have studied Islam and we would like to convert. I remember one example that I wanted to put on record here. Years ago, in Islamic Center of Bloomington, Indiana, a student came and he said, "I'm doing PhD in Islamic studies, in philosophy, and I'm taking a course in Islam. And I would like you to help me to understand Islam more." So we told him that you are welcome, you can come and visit the Islamic Center whenever you want. So he continued to come, and after about a year, he said, "I have studied Islam, I have seen you guys, how you pray and fast and so on. I'm convinced I want to become a Muslim." So this is happening in America because we have freedom of religion. Right. And he became a Muslim.
And we don't have blasphemy laws and Sharia law, except for where a couple of federal judges have allowed it.
Right.
We also would like to get, if we still have time, to get Tom and John to make a comment about this as well.
But let me take it to its conclusion, that we had a job, the director's job in the Islamic Center, and next year he applied and he became our director of the Islamic Center.
Great.
But within 3-4 years, we found him getting slackened in this socialization with Muslims and in his Islam and so on. So after 4 or 5 years, he renounced Islam. So the American strength of freedom of religion, on the one hand, we will accept people to come, and on the other hand, without any problem, we let them go back. And I am convinced that there must be very many, I'm aware of many, but that doesn't bother me. But what excites me is that today, if we make a list of top 50 Muslim leaders, a large number of them were not born Muslims. So that's what strength is.
Okay.
But this cannot happen in other countries because
Right.
over the centuries,
Right.
different interpretations have been made which are extraneous to the Quran and do not actually.
Oh, good. So we can get a declaration that blasphemy laws are extraneous from the Quran, as is the application of Sharia law to civil context.
We have books and books
That's
by
good.
now
No, that,
produced.
real progress.
We have produced enough literature if you want. I gave you last time a couple of those
I've
books.
read 'em. They're very good.
I'm not saying out of nothing. I'm saying that these 50 years have been a rich experience and productivity. We have by now websites, discussions, conversations, fatwas about these issues.
Thank you, Dr. Said. John, I know we don't have much time, so you say. Okay.
Thank you for the question, Ambassador. If we could get Mr. Saeed's views accepted throughout the Middle East, it would be a gigantic step forward. And indeed, the problem with blasphemy laws, as he knows and as you know, is that it is the use of the state to prevent religious speech. It harms non-Muslim minorities, but it also prevents Muslims who wish to speak out about their own religion from speaking out. They're charged with blasphemy if they do so. The Marrakesh Declaration does not deal with this, but it is a realistic step forward. It is from the heart of Islam. And I leave this weekend to go to Rome for a week of discussions with Middle Eastern Muslims about this very issue. They recognize that, as Dr. Saeed does, that this is a serious problem that can't simply be waved away by passing a law. It is a deeply cultural issue that has to be dealt with, but it's important enough, they believe, to get on with it, and we want to help them do that. One of the things that we're going to do is present to them an understanding of the Catholic declaration of the Catholic development of doctrine. The way the Catholic Church came to its understanding of religious freedom was reaching into the deep part of its own doctrine and allowing it to work with history. And hopefully, even though John is correct, there is no pope, there's no magisterium, this is more difficult in Islam, but nevertheless, it's vitally important, and we want to encourage this. So I think this is getting right at the issue, the nub of the issue.
Congressman and Ambassador, I just would like to say in this connection that this is one of these issues that I think points to the need for greater capacity in public diplomacy and foreign information. A huge part of the battle against radical Islamism and in any political warfare involves anathematizing that which is evil. It involves isolating it from its potential population support base and recruitment base, separating it from its allies, and so on. That's the basic principles of political warfare. What this means is that we have to anathematize the radical Islamists. We have to point out their corruption. We have to point out their use of slavery, of sex slavery. You have to point out the many features of totalitarianism that exist under radical Islamist orders, whether it was the Islamic State or the quasi-totalitarianism in Sharia-grounded Islamist states. We have to talk about their active collaboration with criminal activity, including narcotics, kidnapping, human trafficking, smuggling. We have to talk about all of the systematic violation of human rights, the treating of religious minorities as dhimmis, and the blasphemy laws are part of all of this. Now, who's going to do this? We can do some of it, The problem is that there are loads of politically moderate Muslims who believe in religious liberty, who believe in tolerance and pluralism, and many of those people are subjected to fatwas to kill them when they want to talk about these things.
Like Pakistan last week.
Yes, yes. And so these people need to be given a megaphone. They need physical protection. They need, and the megaphone can be through various information media. And some of this stuff requires not only, overt public diplomacy capabilities by what ought to be a new public diplomacy agency, but it requires a covert political action capability in our Central Intelligence Agency where people can be funded, people can, and there are no American fingerprints on it. They can get support, whether it's physical support, where there's no association with intelligence activities. They may get some support from some foundation somewhere. Well, where did that money come from? Well, who knows?
It sounds like Poland in 1983, doesn't it?
You bet.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have 4 more members that wish to ask questions in about 20 minutes, so I'd ask the members to keep their questions to the 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Swazi.
I want to thank everybody for their testimony today. It's been a great education. Every person of faith wants to try and persuade other people to join their faith. We're told to evangelize in my religion, to convince other people to join our faith. And the problem, of course, with Islamists is that we are finding that some people are using violence and oppression to try and persuade people to join their faith. So in practical terms, there's 2.5 billion Christians in the world. There's 1.5 billion, 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. There's 900 million Hindus. There's 300 million Buddhists. There's 40 million Sikhs. There's 14 million Jews, of which 6 million were killed during the Holocaust. And we need to figure out how to focus on Muslims of different majority Muslim countries that are on board with our agenda of trying to stop violence and extremism from being used. So Dr. Farr made reference to the importance of the Middle East. Of the 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, according to the Pew Research report, there's 986 million of the Muslims are in the Asia-Pacific region. There's 317 million in the Middle East. There's 248 million in the Sub-Saharan Africa, 43 million in Europe, 3.4 million in North America, and less than 1 million in South America. So we need to, I believe, focus a lot of our attention on those places that have not gone over to the dark side, so to speak. I'm concerned about Indonesia, which has historically been a very tolerant place, and there have been efforts to try and radicalize the people in Indonesia. As Americans, our country should be working to try and foster this tolerant behavior of Indonesia in other places in the world. One of the second largest countries in the world with Muslims is Pakistan, and we see what we've been trying to do in America to try and rein Pakistan's behavior in on certain things related to their relationship with Afghanistan and behavior in that region. We need to figure out what we need to do more to focus our energies there. India is a great opportunity for us to have a tolerant community with Muslims and what we can do to foster similar to Indonesia. So I want to ask each of you in very practical terms, what's the one thing for each of you? Each get one thing because I only have 3 more minutes. One thing. One thing you think we should be focusing on to try and protect those folks that would normally be our allies in this effort, that we don't want them to be pushed over to the dark side, so to speak, or the one thing that you want to do to try and reverse the trend in places where it's gone bad. Everybody gets one thing, practical terms, what we should be doing to try and address this issue.
We should be empowering, for lack of a better term, the moderates in each of these communities. They do exist, especially in Indonesia, as you said. They exist.
So how could we do that in Indonesia?
We can help to support the civil society organizations like Nahdlatul Ulama. I would add to what Dr. Linchowski said that in addition to the United States public diplomacy and covert action that he recommends, we should be encouraging private groups, civil society groups there and here to do this. So my one thing is go to each of these groups and encourage them to make arguments that are based on their own interests. They already get it. We don't have to wag the Article 18 of the UN Declaration, which is fine, but we've been doing that for years. It doesn't work. What might work is self-interest.
Thank you. Doctor?
I would like to second Dr. Farr's comment. I believe that if we had both a public diplomacy agency and a covert political action capability, we could not only be doing our own information programs in order to ensure that the politically moderate populations in the Islamic world are amply warned about the full implications of the dark side, so to speak.
Where's a good place to focus our attentions other than Indonesia and Pakistan and India?
I think that all of these places.
Well, we can't do all these places.
No, but we need to have a capacity to do it. We broadcast in 50 languages of the Voice of America, which successive administrations, for example, have been busy destroying. We stopped the Arabic service of the Voice of America and replaced it with a rock and roll station. Is that serious public diplomacy?
Is there a particular place that you think is more tolerant now that we're worried about losing, or is there a particular place that you think is going over to the dark side that we got to stop it from happening?
I think that Indonesia is moving in a wrong direction.
So Indonesia is a very big focus.
It's really moving in a wrong direction, and I have some sources that tell me that the Indonesian military and higher authorities are going to let it get worse and worse and worse and finally crack down on it violently in order to stop it the way it has been done there before. And so it's not good, and it's because the war of ideas is not being fought as stoutly and vigorously.
You're not playing nice with the time limits, though. I have to keep moving for my colleagues. Okay, Dr. Saeed.
Congressman, we have this thing in mind because Muslims in America who have been able during the last half a century to create a new reality, whatever questions there were, this is the only place where we have experimented with them and found that they are the heart of Islam. So we have reached out, particularly the government, German and English, British and French. They recognize that. That's why they have been sending from time to time their leaders to visit and participate in our conventions and programs, not as much as we should have. So similarly, I have taken delegations, interfaith delegations from here to Indonesia, because we know in those countries how we would be able to support and reinforce those elements who are very clear about these issues.
Yeah.
And it gets reinforced when there is this exchange. So we need more help.
We should work with the Pakistani Americans to work on Pakistan specifically as well. That's a good idea.
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Hicks?
Two very specific things. Firstly, Saudi Arabia has been propagating extremist ideology around the Islamic world for decades.
Yeah.
And if
they're way ahead.
If they are our best friends in terms of fighting extremism, then they need to start behaving like that.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of specific things that can be raised by the US government and should be raised more firmly. And just secondly, I mentioned Tunisia. And Tunisia is a very important counterexample. On this issue of blasphemy we were talking about, the religious leadership in Tunisia has specifically said that blasphemy is not something that should be punished by the state. And they have made many compromises with the civil government to move forward the political process in Tunisia.
Thank you very much. Thank you to each of you.
Congressman, I just wanted to say in reference to Mr. Hicks's comment, I believe that the U.S. government ought to be considering a little bit more some policies of reciprocity. If the Saudi government is permitted to build all sorts of mosques, get rid of and bring their money and get rid of politically moderate imams who run here in American mosques, by bringing in their money and say, you can have our money, but you've got to take our Wahhabi imam to go with it, and where you can come right out here to Route 7 and buy books in the Islamic Center that talk about how you can properly beat your wife, and you can buy these things on Amazon. Well, if the Saudis can do all of that kind of stuff, maybe there, with a little diplomatic reciprocity, we ought to be able to build, any religious group in the United States ought to be able to go build its church or synagogue or any temple somewhere in Saudi Arabia. I believe that diplomatic reciprocity is something that should be part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Swazi. Thank you, witnesses. I'm going to reserve my time in case there's no time at the end and recognize Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you very much, and let me just note that Mr. Lenchowski is one of the heroes of the Cold War and heroes of ending the conflict with Soviet communism in a way that didn't cost millions of lives. So this is a man who we owe a great deal of gratitude for, and I might add that during his time at the White House, when I worked with him in the White House, he was under vicious attack by numbers of people who supposedly believed in freedom. And this is the man who saved us. That same is true, Mr. Hicks, when we talk about El-Sisi. El-Sisi saved Egypt, and his coalition saved it from becoming a dictatorship based on Islam. And the fact is, yeah, he's got some, the El-Sisi regime is not a perfect regime, and that's for sure. It's got its faults. We have our faults as well. But like during the Cold War, there were people who only could criticize those governments that were standing up against the onslaught of Marxist-Leninism. And as Mr. Lenchowski was trying to point out, with Marxism-Leninism was to, for example, socialism, what radical Islamic terrorist groups now are to moderate Muslims. And we didn't attack socialist regimes during that time period. In fact, I remember some things we were working with, some socialist regimes at that time. We need to work with moderate Muslim groups and not try to nitpick them to make them weak so they can fall to radical Islamic regimes. And that's as simple as that. So with that said, I'd like Mr. Hicks to have a chance to refute what I just said, so go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. Yes, I think I do strongly disagree with what you just said about President Sisi and his role in Egypt. I have been professionally involved with human rights conditions in Egypt for over 30 years, and I can definitely say that the human rights conditions today are far worse than anything I have seen over that whole 30-year period. What we have now is possibly comparable to the Nasserite period, but I'm too young to remember that directly. And nor do I think it's working, and I don't think it's nitpicking to point to the thousands of people who have died in political violence, many of them at the hands of the Egyptian security forces, and call that nitpicking. That is not nitpicking. That is a huge escalation in the level of violence in Egypt.
Now, as long as you have, at the same time, been, you see, here you are testifying today based on focusing on that as compared to all these other regimes that are monstrously worse than what you're talking about. And that's what I refer to Mr. Lenchowski's comparison to the Cold War, to Marxist-Leninism, and that battle that we had. There are people who, during the Cold War, spent all of their time complaining about governments that were on the front edge, and because they were right in the battle line against communism, yeah, things get. You can't be a perfect idealist libertarian when you have when you're confronted with that type of a challenge. We're faced with that kind of challenge today in the world. And one last point, because I know I only got a couple minutes, and that is, how do we make sure that Muslims throughout the world understand that we are on their side and that this 10% of Islam that is decided that they're going to superimpose their radical beliefs on everyone else by terrorizing the world into submission, because that's what this is about, that how do we make sure the other Muslims know we are all human beings and we should work together against whether it's Marxist-Leninist tyranny or Islamic radical tyranny or whatever other kind of tyranny. We need to make sure in countries that are where the oppression of Muslims is clear, like with the Rohingyas, which we passed a resolution yesterday about what's going on in Burma, where a Muslim population is under severe attack and being brutally murdered. Yeah, we spoke out yesterday, and I'm proud to have been part of that. I was also proud that when the Kosovars were denied their right of self-determination, and they were being brutally, again, suppressed and slaughtered by Christian Serbs, we stood up for the right of self-determination of the people of Kosovo, and even though they were overwhelmingly Muslim. So with that, that's the type of thing we have to send, that message that we are a principled country here, and that's how we do that. I would leave that at that. And Mr. Linchowski, I mentioned you several times. Would you like to add anything to that, as you added to my efforts when I was writing President Reagan's speeches?
Congressman, you are very generous, and I can only say that I don't deserve those kind of encomiums, but I was very honored to be one of the cooks in the kitchen in the Reagan White House. And it was a great pleasure and an honor to work with you, because you and your colleagues in the speechwriting shop were some of the greatest articulators of the philosophy that the president represented and wanted to bring to the world. And so I don't want to be patronizing, but I could return the compliment to you in a similar way. So thank you. I just would like to say, when one is at war with major totalitarian movements, systems, that sometimes you have to make alliances. When we were at war with Hitler, we allied ourselves with Stalin, who in some respects may have been even a greater monster than Hitler in terms of the death toll that he effected upon humanity. And genocide of tribes and little nations within the Soviet Union. Sometimes you have to choose the lesser of evils. And indeed, as you suggested, we had to ally ourselves with some countries who, I mean, look at Iran. During the Carter administration, the people, human rights activists, were attacking the Shah's Iran relentlessly because he had a terrible secret police and because he was an authoritarian ruler and all of this kind of stuff. The Shah was the most liberal of all of the realistic political alternatives in Iran at that time. The Soviet Union was hugely active in penetrating Iran with its and controlling and financing the Tudeh party, which was their communist party. There were two major attempts to take over Iran in 1921 when they tried to set up the Republic of Gilan in northern Iran, and in 1945-46 when they tried to set up the independent Republic of Azerbaijan in northern Iran as elements to take over that country. It was a huge, and so we undermined the Shah. We helped delegitimize him. We pulled the rug out from him because he wasn't perfect. And then what did we get? We got radical, Shiite, revolutionary, quasi-totalitarian Islamism in Iran. And so I appreciate the problem of human rights violations in authoritarian countries. And I appreciate the problems that Mr. Hicks has raised about Egypt. I don't know enough about Egypt to comment about it, but on this. But I believe that the greater evil here, rather than traditional authoritarianism, is a totalitarian movement that's metastasizing around the world.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Garrett.
I'm curious, when you came up here and looked at my notes, because you provided a very good segue, I'm going to take the form more of a soliloquy than a colloquy because of the time constraints, and point out that the exchange between Congresswoman Bass and John was really informative, but I wrote this down at the time. Marxist-Leninism and radical Islam, or radical intolerant anything, are similar because both are antithetical to the natural state of humanity. That the Lazarus, I have very little time, with all due respect, and I have a great deal based on what Mr. Rohrabacher said. Let me keep going. The line from the Lazarus poem referencing huddled masses yearning to breathe free comes to mind. If you tell someone what they cannot do, they will inherently wish to try to do that because that is the natural state of man. And so I look to an illustrative piece of text from this country, and I will omit the first word and simply say, shall not make laws respecting the establishment of religion nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or press or the right of people to peaceably assemble, and petition the government for redress of grievances and submit that this should be our standard for the world. However, your statements as it regards to Iran, I think, are illustrative of the reality in which we in the West all too often oversimplify things by suggesting that perhaps it is either black or white. The deposition of the Shah was in no arguable sense a reaction to a lack of atrocities on the part of the secret police in Iran, but what it begat was bloodshed on a scale not seen in that region for years. That began in 1979, and then punctuated with an exclamation point in '88, and then again during the Green Revolution just less than a decade ago. With that, I would ask that we enter into the record the cover, title page, and preface, which is a total of 7 pages, of Iran, Where Mass Murderers Rule. And I would point out also that I think that we oversimplify the issue of Islam. I will submit candidly that despite my Christian faith, I am delighted to say that there are many Muslims who I count among my friends. Having said that, I will decry and condemn radical Islam vehemently and full-throatedly, as should everyone here, as they also should with any radical, intolerant practitioner of Christianity or Judaism or any other faith that seeks to impose upon others against their natural law right to determine for themselves how they choose to worship or if they choose to worship. And that should be where the United States stands. While I take exception with Mr. Hook's comments as it relates to some of the circumstances in Egypt, I would submit that as it relates to Saudi Arabia, if we are to engage in arms deals amounting to trillions of dollars in trade, I don't think it's too much to ask that they stop publishing texts to the entire Islamic world in their various languages, adhering to a strict Wahhabist standard. And I would also point out that the Sufis massacred in the hundreds not so long ago were in fact Muslims who believed that they should be able to believe differently as Muslims, and they're just as dead as any Jew or Christian or atheist who ever died at the tip of a religious motivated spear. So diversity is strength so long as that diversity is tolerant of diversity, and diversity that you can see how we worship, who we love, how we look is important, but the diversity that we can't see that exists between our left and right ear in a world where we make human rights paramount is equally, if not more so important. So I just wish we had more time on this subject matter. I would call upon my colleagues to take a step back and understand that condemning radical Islam is not condemning Islam, and that you should be equally willing to condemn radical practitioners of any faith, whether they are pushing the Rohingya from their ancestral lands. That the American role, in order to have credibility, is not to be the parent who tells their child not to drink while buying a bottle of liquor, but who says, we're tolerant of others here, it works well here, and Mr. Saeed, your comments have been very appreciated to that end, and it will work well for you too. I apologize for my soliloquy, understandably because of time, and I didn't mean to cut you off or be disrespectful, but this is what happens when you're a junior member. God bless. Thank you all.
And without objection, your offering is entered into the record. I'm going to take a 1 minute, because I waited for everybody else to ask the question. Many times it's debated about the United States' role in foreign resources, giving monies, resources, having people on the ground in places where it's very dangerous, and experiencing some of the matters that we were speaking about today. Could each of you just give me like 30 seconds on what happens if the United States fails to have an influence in these countries or starts pulling back, and who fills that void that might be created if the United States doesn't continue with its current activities in some of these countries where we're seeing this extreme behavior?
I will just say that the United States is where religious freedom has been has reached its apogee. If it is lost in this country, where can it be regained? That is the stakes that we are talking about today.
John?
I can only see a worsening of the situation, because I think that so many of the radical Islamist movements have an enormous amount of momentum on their side. And one thing that concerns me a lot here is what's going on in Europe, the establishment of separatist enclaves where Sharia law is dominant, where that have become de facto no-go zones for people to travel. You can buy an app now to put on your iPhone that tells you whether you're in a no-go zone in Paris or not. And this is, are these enclaves within Europe going to try to be, part of a system of religious pluralism, or are they going to try to set up systems that are in complete contravention with Western concepts of human rights? I'm very concerned about that dimension of this. It's not simply a dimension of terrorism. I call it in my written testimony, resettlement jihad, where Sharia and Sharia supremacism.
Dr. Said?
Yeah, I have made a point that I have tried to make a point that the emergence of Muslim community in America in this pluralist democracy is an asset not only for America, not only for Muslims, for the whole world. So we are going to provide a model to Europe, and eventually we should be able to fight those evils which are bothering us in the rest of the world as well. So it's a wonderful resource, and you need to recognize that. We need to recognize that.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Hicks?
I think we have a good example of what happens if the United States withdraws when we look at Syria. The powers that have moved into that vacant space have been authoritarian powers like Russia and sectarian powers like Iran. And that, of course, is terrible for human rights, it's terrible for religious freedom, and it's terrible for U.S. interests.
Thank you. I thank you all for your testimony. I thank you for all appearing here. I thank my colleagues for their pointed questions. The record will remain open for 10 days in case any member wants to submit a question that we would ask you to then to respond to in writing. This hearing is adjourned. Oh, here's one.
Thank you. God bless you. You should come.
Thank you very much.